I'm standing outside the Federal Court of Canada building in downtown Toronto's concrete jungle. I've just spent the morning in courtroom 7C. We have one lawyer. There are 4 lawyers for the government, 2 lawyers for the Elections Canada office, 2 lawyers for Trudeau's Justice Department, and then 3 bureaucrats supporting them. There are 7 government lawyers and bureaucrats fighting against our one lawyer. And of course, there's the entire investigative staff of Elections Canada behind them. I estimate that between the lawyers and the bureaucrats, there are 20 people on the Canadian taxpayers' dime prosecuting me for the book I published more than 4 years ago called The Libranos. It's actually the most best-selling book that I've ever published. It was a criticism of Trudeau and his corruption. And I footnoted the book intensively. Not a single fact in that book has ever been disputed. It's got that really fun cover for anyone over 40. They know what it refers to. The Libranos is a takeoff of The Sopranos, a classic TV show about a mob boss from New Jersey called Tony Soprano. I don't think anyone under 40 knows what that's about, but Trudeau certainly knows what it's about, and he hated that book. And so very early on, I remember it was over Christmas 2019, he had Elections Canada investigate me as the author and publisher and that book, and he actually retained 2 30-year veterans of the RCMP to come after me. These weren't just to go after an author and a publisher, who do you even choose? Well, he found 2 of the most senior Mounties he could, and he actually got them to go after an author. And they summoned me to their secure headquarters in Hull, Quebec. And they interrogated me for an hour. As you know, I brought a hidden camera in there and recorded some of the crazy things they said. And I want to show you some excerpts from that just to remind you. I'll tell you some of the things they said. They acknowledged there were 24 books published about Trudeau during the 2019 campaign. That's when you publish books about politicians during an election. After the election is over, people aren't that interested in a campaign book. They acknowledged that my book was the only one being prosecuted. They asked me questions about my editorial plans. They asked me about all sorts of ideas that were Rebel News business. And they asked me, and this was very key, why didn't I register the book with the government? Here's some excerpts from that hidden video.
Today we're here about Rebel News Network Limited.
Oh, I know that. And I'm just asking you to confirm that not a single other loving book of Trudeau is being investigated.
But once we're done, if you believe that there should be complaints that are...
No, because I'm not a censor like you. I'm not a bully and a censor. I'm not a bureaucrat looking to justify my budget like you. I go out and earn my living every day, fella. You call in authors to grill them about a book criticizing your boss. Think about who you are.
We call the director of Rebel News Network Limited.
Yeah, who happens to be the author of the book. I think there's going to be a chapter about you 2 fellas in the next edition. Do you have any more questions there?
Certainly do.
The knowledge that you would have or not have of the Election Act, the Canada Elections Act, when you are planning the book and the new third-party rules, because I believe there's some comments on your site as well about that. Did you give any consideration of saying, maybe I should register as a third party for this circumstance, or maybe I shouldn't because of my interpretation of what I'm going to do, or did you not make that determination?
Tim, I appreciate the question. Yeah, I absolutely did think about that at great length.
Do you want to share any of those thoughts?
Well, sure, some of them. I mean, I thought the day I register with the government to write a book is the day we no longer are the True North strong and free. And if Elections Canada's commissioners are stupid enough to prosecute me for writing, publishing, and promoting a book about an election during an election, then that's an important fight to have, because we need to roll back these pencil-neck bureaucrats and their blackface boss, and we need to remind them that we're still a free country. So I thought about it long and hard, Tim.
Well, I enjoyed giving them a bit of a tongue lashing, but they got the last laugh, didn't they? Because they convicted me of publishing an illegal book, and they fined me thousands of dollars. By illegal book, here's what I mean. They claim that that book was actually a campaign document that needed to be registered with the government as if I was a political party. But like I say, there were 24 books published during the election season of 2019. 23 of those 24 books were either neutral or positive towards Justin Trudeau. For example, Aaron Wary at the CBC state broadcaster published a loving hagiography of Trudeau. That could be called liberal partisan propaganda, but of course it's not, because it's a book. And the Canada Elections Act itself specifically, as you can see here, exempts books and the promotion of books as long as two things are met. Number one, are they sold for a commercial price? Yes, that's the case of Aaron Wary's love letter and my criticism. And number two, whether they would be published regardless of an election. And I don't really know what that means, because regardless of an election now, an election coming, I mean, there will always be an election. There's always the next election. I don't really understand that. Rebel News publishes books about Trudeau all the time. I published one called Trumping Trudeau. I published one called China Virus. We talk about Trudeau every day. This one was timed to coincide with the election campaign, like the other 23 books published about Trudeau. I was never asked if I would publish it regardless of an election, because I don't even think the question makes sense. There will always be an election. If elections were somehow suspended in Canada, well, I think we would publish that book and many more, don't you think? But instead, in order to convict me, because my book was totally legal, it was sold at a commercial value, and it was published regardless of an election, they needed to change the law just for me, to weaponize the Canada Elections Act against an author for the first time in history. Never before in Canadian history has a book been prosecuted or fined under the Canada Elections Act. It's never happened before. And my book, I mean, I like the book. I think it's a good book, but it wasn't particularly startling. It wasn't particularly innovative. It just criticized Justin Trudeau the same way books historically have criticized Stephen Harper or Brian Mulroney or Jean Chrétien or whomever. So Elections Canada made a sneaky little change. Although, and let me put it on the screen one more time, as you can see here, Canada Elections Act says the test is, was it published at a commercial rate? And number two, would it have been published regardless of whether there's an election? Yes and yes. But Elections Canada changed the rule just for me. They said, no, if you timed the election to coincide with a campaign, that's against the law. And Levant admitted he did that, so we got him. Yeah, that's not what the law says. And like I say, all 24 books about the 2019 campaign were published during the 2019 campaign. That is, when you publish books, it would be sort of crazy to write a book about the election campaign and then wait until the election is over to publish a book about the election campaign. That doesn't make any sense. That's why that's not in the law. But that's how Elections Canada's sneaky little lawyers changed the law to get me. They couldn't get me under the law, so they changed the law, and they fined me $3,000. Now, I'm in this position from time to time. $3,000 is a lot of money, but it's not going to bankrupt Rebel News, thank God. And so we had a choice: just pay the $3,000 and grumble and move on, or say, whoa, what are you doing? Why are you criminalizing books and writing them? And since when do we summon authors to secret meetings where they're being interrogated by senior RCMP officers about their politics? And they went through our tweets and they went through our videos. When does that happen? Since when do police do that? And so we did the principal thing that we like to do, is we go to court and we appeal. Now, the first time you appeal an Elections Canada ruling, you appeal it within Elections Canada itself, which is rather ridiculous. The same people go through it and review it. So obviously we were convicted a second time. Today we're in the Federal Court of Canada. And like I say, there are 7 Trudeau staffers in court versus our one lawyer. And I'm excited to be in court, and I'm excited to test this, and I'm excited the fact that we're the only people who would do this. I'm also sad that we're the only people who would do this. I got to say, in Canada, I can think of 5 organizations off the top of my head that are supposed to care about freedom of the press and freedom of speech. There's something called the Canadian Association of Journalists. There's something called Canadian Journalists for Free Expression. There's a Canadian Civil Liberties Association. There's PEN Canada, of which I'm a dues-paying member. There's Amnesty International. That's 5 right there. Not one of them has even said a word, even tweeted a word, let alone put out a press release, let alone sent lawyers to intervene in court, let alone said, hang on a second, since when do we summon authors to an interrogation? Since when do we fine authors for a book? And this, of course, was a book. It's for sale as a book. It was an Amazon bestseller. It actually sold more copies than the other 23 books combined. It's a real book. And by the way, whose right is it for the police to determine what's a real book or not anyways? But obviously, the Libranos is a real book. You yourself might even have one. By the way, it's still for sale on Amazon. So none of those 5 so-called civil liberties groups were there or were anywhere. I was sitting in the court alone with my lawyer. That's okay. Sometimes we're alone and we fight those lonely battles and we win. It's a wonderful feeling. A couple of weeks ago, we beat Stephen Guilbeault. We had a consent order commanding him to unblock us on Twitter and pay us $20,000 in costs. And the reason I call that a victory is it depoliticizes the government. Politicians can't block or ban their enemies list just because they don't like people. I thought that was a big win. We're in court today, but I have to say, and this is, I'm talking to you now at noon. I'll do an update later after court. I have to say, I don't think it's going well. Our lawyer is making the case, but the judge, there was one moment where the judge in particular said, and I'm paraphrasing, well, what's the big deal of having to show the government your plan for the book, your marketing plan, your editorial plan? What's the big deal? Are you kidding me? What's the big deal? Now, by the way, look at the Canada Elections Act. The line before the book exemption, and by the way, it's an exemption not just for books, but for the promotion of books. And they really hate the fact that we promoted this book with a lawn sign that had 3 words on it, buy the book. They hate that lawn sign because it was so much fun. Anyways, both books and the promotion of books are exempted, but look at the line right before it in the Canada Elections Act. Obviously, it exempts editorials, letters, opinions, because if anything weighing in on an election is a government-regulated activity, well, then every single human with an opinion would be treated like a government problem. So imagine a judge saying, oh, what's the big deal of an author having to go down to the police and explain himself? What's the big deal to tell your plans? Well, what's the big deal about any journalist? What's the big deal about anyone having, you know what, we live in a free country. That's a big deal. And the idea of journalists being summoned to talk to the police is what they do in dictatorships, not in Canada. And I'm really worried. Now, I got to say that maybe the judge was just asking these difficult questions to see what my lawyer would say in response, but I'm not sure. She seemed to genuinely think it's no big deal for us to have to go and sit down and answer questions and be grilled by a couple of 30-year RCMP vets just because. And there was one moment where an Elections Canada lawyer said, yeah, we most likely violated Rebel News's charter rights under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. She actually said that, and there weren't gasps in the courtroom being just me and a bunch of lawyers. It was just a matter of fact. Yeah, sure, we probably did violate Rebel News's civil liberties. Yeah, welcome to Canada in 2023. Now, the day's not over, but I'm not sure if it's going to get any better, because up next are the Justice Department lawyers who are going to be arguing that this is fine and this is normal and that's Canada. Look, I'm a little bit depressed about this. I mean, I think that part of Rebel News is to fight the uphill battles, to fight the tough battles, to be contrarian, to be non-compliant. We never take the easy way. It's just not in our blood. For the last 3 years during the lockdown and the forced vaccine mandates, we didn't take the easy way. We stood with those who had no friends. We were friends to them. We, in fact, created a whole civil liberties group ourselves to provide lawyers for people charged with lockdown offenses or pandemic offenses. So we are with the friendless. today it just feels odd to be the friendless one myself. I mean, listen, I know you're my friends, but it feels odd to have the establishment institutions so unfriendly, to have a judge who's just so blasé about government being able to interrogate journalists, to have a Elections Act lawyer so blasé about violating our rights. And of course, all this happened in 2019. That's when the election was. That's when the book came out. But since then, we've learned so much about election interference in Canada, especially by the Chinese Communist Party. And just a couple of weeks ago, Elections Canada put out a report, and they didn't even mention the word China. Blacklock's had that story. So here we are with 7 lawyers and 10 investigators. We got close to 20 people bearing down on Little Rebel News for my little book. And that's a higher investigative priority for them than the Chinese Communist Party literally interfering in elections and probably tilting the outcome in several of them. I don't know. Sometimes people say, why do you fight? Move to Florida, they say. I heard that a lot during the lockdowns. We fight because this is our home. We fight because we know it can be better. We fight because you never know when a victory will come. We've had some surprise victories before. In this same court in 2019, Justin Trudeau tried to block us and our reporters from attending the election debates. We went to this court and we won. It happened again in 2021. Like I said just a couple of weeks ago, we beat Stephen Guilbeault. So you can win these David and Goliath battles. I think, though, when you look at the numbers, we probably lose more than we win because we're going uphill, because we're going against the grain. I don't know. I think this is an important fight. What do you think? Maybe it's not important. Maybe it's just one book and the fine's only $3,000 and just pay it and grumble and move on. But I can't stand the thought of a country where police do that and get away with it, and they do it at the behest of a politician. There was a moment in court today when the lawyer for the Canada elections was going through one of David Menzies' videos and was so mad that David Menzies said we got to get rid of Trudeau, going through our tweets. And I thought, frankly, who the hell are you? Who the hell are you? I'm not interested in your opinion about my political views. And back to what I think this turns on, the law itself. The fact that the government cannot get me under the law because we published the book for a commercial price, and we would have published it regardless of whether there was an election or not. That doesn't even make sense, but of course we would have. They had to change the law in their own mind to get us. Well, you scheduled the book for the election. Yeah, us and everyone else. That's what publishers do. I know I'll be deeply dispirited, and my faith in justice will be shaken if some partisan, weaponized bureaucrats can make up a new law and go after Trudeau's enemy and tag him just to please Trudeau, and if the courts shrug about it. I don't want to be depressed. The trial is only half done. And who knows? Maybe the judge has a poker face. Maybe those tough questions for my lawyer were just the judge putting my lawyer to the test. Maybe the judge has within her heart a love for civil liberties that I just don't know about. We're going to go back into the court now because we're only on a short lunch break. I'm going to leave you with an update from another trial that's going on today, namely the trial of Tamara Lich in Ottawa. I was there yesterday, and I felt very confident for Tamara Lich because the prosecution's case is so pitifully weak. By the way, yesterday in Calgary was the trial of Derek Reimer, the pastor who protested peacefully outside a drag queen story hour. Rebel News is also crowdfunding that legal fight. We're into so many legal fights. Sometimes I think we're a law firm that actually occasionally does some journalism as opposed to the other way around. Let me leave you with an update from Ottawa, and then I'm going to come back to you after court here is done for the day. And I'll let you know if the second half of our hearing is more encouraging than the first half. But let me promise you this either way. You know me. You've known me for a while. I've been running Rebel News for almost 9 years now, and I was a political activist and journalist for years before that. Even if we lose, you know I'm not going to stop fighting. I'll appeal this if we lose, and we will fight. And you know what? I'm going to write another book about Trudeau. And if he wants to arrest me for it or jail me or sentence me, bring it on. I'll come back to you in a moment. court hearing is adjourned. It's done in the matter of Rebel News and the Elections Canada office. The judge has said she's going to reserve her ruling, which means she's going to go back, think about it, do some research, and write it out in long form and send it to us written. Obviously, you wouldn't have a complex constitutional matter like this just spoken off the cuff by a judge. So that's not surprising. It might take days, more likely weeks, or even most likely, I'd say months. But I think I know how it's going to go for a couple of reasons. First of all, I learned that some of the lawyers in there for the government, you had some Justice Department lawyers. You also had extremely expensive private sector lawyers hired by the government to squash us. It really was 7 against 1 in there. And, there's this line in the Coen Brothers remake of True Grit. That's a great movie if you haven't seen it, where there's some bandito they're trying to get to do the right thing. They say, we'll give you a good lawyer. He says, I don't need a good lawyer. I need a good judge. And that's sort of how I felt today, because the judge, Justice Strickland is her name, never seemed perturbed at all by the onerous and invasive positions that Elections Canada was taking about books. She thought it was completely normal and acceptable that authors and publishers should have to disclose their plans to Elections Canada to avoid prosecution. I found that very odd and unsettling. The bulk of this afternoon's hearing was the Justice Department of Canada, so that's Trudeau's in-house lawyers. And they were talking a lot about election law and election finance law in general, which is fine, I suppose, as long as it goes. He said some terrifying things, which are, I guess, the position of the government of Canada. He said, for example, unregulated speech is a threat to democracy. That's what he said. I think I have that verbatim, actually. Unregulated speech is a threat to democracy. Really? Or maybe he said a threat to elections. No, that's actually the stuff of elections. It's the regulated speech. The regulations, it's the censorship that's a threat to elections. And this guy represents the government of Canada, and the judge was sort of just taking it all in. No questions, no pushback at all. One of the leading cases that the federal government talked about today was a case actually brought by Stephen Harper about 20 years ago. You might recall that before he was prime minister, Stephen Harper was the leader of something called the National Citizens Coalition. And one of the things they did is they challenged a limitation on election spending, and they lost. Stephen Harper went on to become prime minister and amended some of the laws, if I recall. But it made me think Stephen Harper had to champion free speech 20 years ago. 20 years ago, there were still some other civil liberties groups in Canada. Here we are in 2023, almost 2024, and it's fallen to us. Stephen Harper had to fight to the Supreme Court of Canada for freedom of speech, and he lost. And here we are 20 years later, Rebel News is fighting, so far only at the federal court. I hope we don't lose either, but maybe it's a burden that's fallen to us, because maybe just like Stephen Harper knew, if he didn't fight that fight, no one would. Well, maybe if Rebel News doesn't fight this fight, no one would. Again, the silence of that room, it was actually a very large courtroom. It was sort of ironic. On Monday, I was in court in Lethbridge. They chose a very small courtroom because it was packed. They could have had 150 seats filled. There were so many supporters for Arthur Pavlovsky, and the judge put everyone in the smallest room possible. Here in Toronto, it was a huge room at a beautiful courthouse, actually. The federal court building in Toronto is actually beautiful and modern and huge. And it was empty. On my side of it's almost like the bride and the groom, you sit on which side. So the rebel side was me and my lawyer, Aaron, and then his paralegal was sitting there. And on the government side were 4 lawyers and 3 lawyer bureaucrats. And it was like, but still, the room was cavernous. No one cared. I just worry about that, because I believe that freedom is a Canadian character. I believe, don't take it from me, take it from Laurier, take it from Diefenbaker. I think it was Laurier who said, freedom is part of our national identity. Diefenbaker went so far as to enshrine the Bill of Rights in Canada. Even the Liberal Party of Canada 40 years ago enshrined the Charter of Rights in Canada, Pierre Trudeau in concert with the premiers. I'm worried that's slipping away. And the thing is, a radical law student today in 5 years becomes a radical lawyer, in 10 years becomes a radical law firm partner, and in 20 years becomes a radical judge. And so the left has planted these seeds of tyranny and authoritarianism, and they wait and they water them and they grow over time. And in the 20 years since Stephen Harper's free speech case, I think the courts and society has moved towards authoritarianism. I find it troubling, and it's a burden that falls to us at Rebel News. I'll pick it up. I don't want to be too morose. I mean, by the way, we still might win. Although I certainly got the feeling that this judge was going to side with the censors. It was really creepy to me to hear the Justice Department say that the $3,000 fine and the lengthy investigation and the $100,000 in legal fees, that none of that was a charter violation at all. It was just, that was very Orwellian. In fact, Trudeau's Justice Department lawyer invoked Orwell's name and said, no, it's got nothing to do with that. It's absolutely not Orwellian to investigate an author and fine him $3,000 for wrongthink. And I thought to myself, that's an excellent lawyer for Justin Trudeau, because that is Justin Trudeau's own approach. Say something with a straight face, just a brazen statement like, it is not Orwellian to prosecute, convict, and fine an author $3,000 for a book. That is not Orwellian. You are wrong. Yeah, perfect lawyer for his client. He'll probably get a promotion. He'll probably be made a judge. Well, that's it. If you want to see any background of this, all our court documents, you can go to thelibranos.com. And even though the book is considered contraband, I guess, it's still for sale if you want to read it on Amazon.ca. The book's not that up to date anymore. I mean, I wrote it in 2019. It's 4.5 years later, so obviously so much more has happened. But as I was sitting there in court, I thought to myself, I'm going to write another book. I'm going to write another book about Justin Trudeau, and I'm going to publish that other book. And if they want to come for me again, let them. Because I am not going to accept this censorship as either Canadian or certainly as a condemnation or a stigma. I simply disagree. And I'm going to continue writing. And frankly, I think they're going to have to throw me in jail. Or even then, you can write in jail, can't you? I don't know what they're going to do. But I'm not done writing, and I'm not done talking. And I know you're not either. Thanks for your support. You can find out more info about this at thelibranos.com. And if you can help me pay my legal bill, I'd appreciate it, because there were 7 lawyers on the taxpayers' teeth there today, and I got to pay our bill just from Rebel News. That's the end of our show today. Thanks for your help. Until next time, on behalf of all of us at Rebel's capital city of Toronto and across the country, to you at home, good night, and keep fighting for freedom.